Well, hello and welcome to this Poynter Fellowship conversation with Christopher Flavelle, a reporter for the New York Times. Thanks to the Poynter Fellowship that allows us to bring leading journalists to Yale for these sorts of exchanges. I'm Keller Easterling, professor at Yale School of Architecture, and I'm co-hosting with Paul Barreau and Peter McConnell, Justin Farrell, and Karen Sito from Yale's School of the Environment. Many thanks to them. And I know that students and faculty from our schools, from urban studies, and from all over the university are here this evening. We're so glad that Christopher Flavelle could join us. As you know, he's a climate reporter at the New York Times, where he's covering how people and governments and institutions and businesses respond to the effects of global warming. He focuses on what adaptation means for home building, for real estate, for insurance, for finance, for agriculture, healthcare, and other industries, as well as the unequal effects of those changes. Before joining the Times, Flavelle worked at Bloomberg, ProPublica, Slate, Newsweek, and The Walrus magazine. He received a 2018 National Press Foundation Award for his coverage of the struggle to cope with flooding. And he was part of the team of Times reporters who were finalists for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for public service for their coverage of the political war on science. Originally from Toronto, he lives in Washington. He's coming to us from DC this evening. I have another sort of storm. And many students and faculty at Yale School of Architecture and Yale School of the Environment who are working on various forms of, we're all working on various forms of adaptation in the face of flooding and wildfires, and we're all avid readers of Flavelle's reporting. He's deliberately designed his beat to treat issues of environmental justice and climate gentrification and the disproportionate effects of risk and disaster and dislocation in the face of racial inequality and pandemic. Humans have made some of the rules, but non-human agents are also making the rules. And the reports have dealt with, I mean, it's the range of the reports that's so interesting because they've dealt with everything from shifting insurance practices and housing sales to prenatal health and climate risks. So Chris will first take a bit of time to talk about the state of play with regard to climate adaptation in the US. But it's really the discussion that we're keen to enjoy. So I would encourage you to add your questions to the chat or let yourself be known at the end of the talk and I can call on you. This is a meeting, not a webinar, so we can talk to each other. And the title of Chris's talk is Climate Adaptation, America's Growing Struggle to Live with Global Warming. And I will turn the floor over to him.
All right, thank you so much for that. Those kind words. And thanks for the invitation. It's a privilege to be doing this. I am going to try to keep my opening remarks pretty brief because my hope is to have as much time as possible for questions. It's the questions that I'm here for. So again, my name is Christopher Flavelle. I've been covering climate adaptation since 2016. And more or less full-time since 2017. Started covering it at Bloomberg, and then I got hired at the New York Times last year to keep covering it. It's, as we just heard, it's a broad beat. It's almost endlessly broad. So in thinking of how to organize some comments, I'm gonna make some observations about what climate adaptation means and why it matters. And I'm gonna focus on why it's so hard. And I'm sure this is a distinguished audience. Some of the stuff might be obvious to some people, but I'll go through it at a pretty quick pace. So starting with a point that I think is obvious, but may not be to everyone, the effects of climate change are already happening. This is not a future conversation. Number one. Number two, they're going to get worse. What that means in human terms is increasingly severe and perhaps frequent hurricanes, more frequent and intense flooding, more wildfires, more heat waves, more droughts, almost any kind of extreme weather event we're likely to see worsen. It also means, of course, rising seas, taking away more and more coastal land. I'm going to leave aside for this conversation the question of emissions. Certainly, one could talk about adaptation in the context of, well, if it's so hard, let's cut emissions faster so we don't have to deal with it. I haven't seen any realistic scenarios or projections that say that we will cut greenhouse gases fast enough that we don't have to deal with the effects. My sense is that we'll be living with this for a long time and it will get worse. I had a story today on geoengineering and the increasing research into geoengineering, and that research is based on the premise that we are not going to cut emissions fast enough to prevent this from getting worse. So I think I'm happy to go into that in the questions if we want to. But taking as our premise that this is going to get worse, even without resorting to geoengineering, there's a lot of things that we can do, we being a community, a country, humanity, to protect ourselves more from the effects of climate change. We're going to just breeze through some of them and then afterwards look at how well they're working. And the spoiler is they're not working very well. First thing we can do individually is just changing our routines. That could mean everything from shifting more of our activities to nighttime when it's too hot outside. It could mean using more air conditioning. It could mean more personal cooling devices, which I once sampled for Bloomberg. They don't work very well yet. It can mean planting different kinds of crops. There's almost an endless range of what you as an individual can do. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that category, not because it's not important, but it only goes so far. What strikes me as more important, but also more fraught, is this question of what we can do collectively, usually through government action, because that tends to be where you can make more of a difference. There's two kinds of policy decisions that strike me as especially important. You can group these in different ways. This is how I group them. First, you can fortify your community, your homes, through a range of measures. You can do better building codes. You can have higher seawalls, tougher levees, better stormwater management systems. There's a lot you can do in terms of infrastructure and the built environment. I'm sure many of those on listening right now will know what I'm talking about. Those changes can be expensive. They usually are expensive, but their advantages, they usually don't require much in the way of sacrifice. We can pretty much keep on living our lives the way we have before, behind versions of walls. And the second category is if and when those don't work or those are too expensive, I'm simplifying here, but we can just get out of the way. We can stop building homes in places that are risky. We can help people who live in those areas move someplace else. We can move our footprint, as it were. Now, over the long run, those changes probably aren't as expensive, but their cost comes in psychological terms. It means giving up a place that you'd like to live or a way of life you'd like to keep. Both those options on paper make a lot of sense, right? With some room for controversy, but they both work, right? The interesting part is none of them seem to be working right now. And I think the reason is fairly simple. I'm simplifying a little bit, but not too much. The people generally who would benefit from those steps tend not to be the same people who would lose from those steps. And the ones who would lose tend to have more power. So what does that mean in practice? Start with building codes, kind of the most obvious entry point here. There's a survey last month that we wrote about, and it found that an overwhelming majority of people, it was 84% of respondents, including 3/4 of Republicans, supported mandatory building codes in risky areas. And we wrote the story in part because I was stunned by that number. I was stunned because you very rarely see jurisdictions with mandatory, tough, up-to-date building codes. By one estimate, just 1/3 of jurisdictions in the US have adequate disaster-resistant provisions for homes and businesses. There's different ways of cutting that number, but I think there's a consensus that the majority of jurisdictions don't have what you would think of as up-to-date, adequate codes. The federal government has looked at that, and they said that the money isn't the problem. They said the return on investment from up-to-date building codes can be $11 for every dollar spent. So dollars and cents, it's kind of a no-brainer. But the important thing is the same report found the benefits of stricter codes mainly go to people who live in the building, or at least who own the building, not people who develop them. And that's important because when I write about building codes, which I do frequently, there's a consistent theme, and that theme is that you've got two sides. On one side, you've got typically insurance companies and consumer safety advocates saying, yes, we need our codes. On the other, you tend to have home builders, and home builders tend to oppose stricter codes, and they tend to win those fights. So it's a remarkably sort of stable field, and it's an array of forces that tends to have the same outcome, which is it's very hard to get up-to-date codes adopted in most jurisdictions. So that's why that one doesn't work. The theme of perverse incentives continues when you look at why we keep building in places that are risky. Building and rebuilding, I should say, after disaster. So perhaps the most obvious example here is coastal developments, anywhere along a beach. There was a report last year that we wrote about, and it found in many coastal states, the rate of home construction in the most flood-prone areas that are going to be underwater, was growing faster than in the rest of the state and in safer areas. The same phenomenon happens when you're looking at wildfires. Experts, of course, call this the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. And in California and many Western states, that WUI accounts for a huge share of new developments for a lot of reasons, but it's a consistent trend. I think it's worth noting before we move on from home building, the trick about where you build a home or even how you build a home is those decisions last for a long time, decades at least, sometimes more than that. And so if you build in a risky place, you are locking in that level of risk for generations who weren't involved in that decision. So this stuff matters. So why do cities keep allowing homes to get built in these risk-prone areas? Part of the answer is human nature, right? People like to live, what's the word, high amenity value. High amenity value can be a beachfront. It can be a sort of a beautiful cabin in the hills by the woods. We tend to find things beautiful that are also dangerous when it comes to real estate. So people want to be there, but that is not all of it. Cities and counties have to approve that construction, and they do approve it. And they approve it for one overarching reason, which is they benefit from the tax revenue, from the construction, from the property tax, from the economic activity that goes to having new residents. So there's a pretty consistent and strong incentive at the local level to allow that building. And there's a second reason why it happens, which is the people who permit these constructions, they know what's going to happen. They know what the odds are of a flood or a hurricane or a wildfire. They also know that when that happens, they probably won't pay the cost. So there's a perverse incentive here in terms of levels of government. Local officials tend to want more development, even in risky areas. The federal government, FEMA, HUD, the Corps of Engineers, tends to pay the cost when something goes wrong, or insurance companies pay it. So we'll come back to that later. But for now, there's a disconnect between what you could do and what's actually happening. And the final category that I think is important to look at is what you would call buyouts, and at a broader level, you would call managed retreats. This idea that people wind up in these areas, they might not always want to stay there, they might not realize what the risk was when they bought that home, and eventually they're probably going to be open to getting money to leave that area. Now, buyouts are sort of a great idea, again, on paper. And you would think that the number of buyouts that are happening would be skyrocketing as the number of disasters increases and as the federal government becomes more open to this, but it's not. It's largely flat. It fluctuates a bit. It's mostly flat. So again, what's going on here? One answer, again, is human nature. People are reluctant to leave their homes and their neighborhoods, and that's certainly, only the most callous person could knock them for that. But it's not the whole answer. I've had the chance to report from a number of places that get hit multiple times by flooding or by hurricanes, and there's a very consistent trend, at least that I've found anecdotally. And the trend is after one disaster being pushed from your home once, people tend not to want to leave. They want to rebuild. They want to stay. They remain optimistic about the future of that neighborhood. After the second disaster, the second flood or the wildfire, and certainly after the third, that changes. And people tend to be very, very open to an offer to leave. Now, the trick here is they don't always have the chance. The way US buyout programs work is the federal government usually funds it, but it only pushes it when the city or county and the state are along for it. So what can happen is counties and cities will object, and they'll object again for a very straightforward reason, because if they lose those homes, they lose the tax revenue that comes with them. And as a result, they worry about the economic future of their community. Now, I'm happy to get into whether that concern is legitimate. My sense is that in the long run, that probably isn't a well-founded concern, but it is the concern. And so the result is, although buyouts make a lot of sense, they tend not to happen. So the result of all of this, building codes, where we build, our reluctance to move out of areas once we built in those areas, is that Americans remain more vulnerable than they have to be to the effects of climate change, even holding steady emissions. And you almost can't stress enough how problematic that is. There's a human cost. People have their lives upended. They get hurt. Some get killed. There's a cost to first responders. There's a cost to rebuild anywhere. But there's a financial cost too, right? And the financial cost to the country is not small. One number said the government spent almost $500 billion on disaster relief and recovery since 2005 alone. So it's a huge cost, and it's growing. The people on this call who have studied this perhaps won't be super surprised by any of the stuff I've discussed so far. But again, happy to go through it. I think the important thing that I want to note at this point is the landscape that I've just described has roughly been static for the last 5 or 10 years. It's not going to stay static, right? As the cost of disasters keeps going up, we're seeing important changes. Start with insurance. It's perhaps the most obvious one. When I started covering this stuff, there was this sort of a vague idea that eventually, maybe potentially, parts of the country, no one knows where, would become uninsurable. You couldn't get home insurance or business insurance, and like there was real fear about that, but it was a sort of a vague future fear. That's here. That started. It started fast. Most people thought. The most obvious example is California, where anybody who lives there might know this. The government imposed a moratorium last December, on insurance companies dropping customers in areas or near areas hit by wildfires. They are currently working hard to find the next solution, because insurance companies keep on saying, we are not going to keep on covering these homes. Either let us raise rates significantly or we're leaving. And the state has no really good answer for that. It's most pronounced in California, but it's far from a California only problem. I've talked to insurance commissioners around the West who say they've got versions of this, and they are all worried about it because they know there's no good play. They can make it easier for insurers to raise rates, but that just puts the pain on homeowners. They can push down rates, but insurers leave. It will probably, I don't want to get into predictions, but presumably it will wind up with eventually more homeowners being pushed into fair plans or high risk plans. But the point is that's starting. And once that kind of change starts, there's a fear factor that comes in. The other thing that's starting is you used to hear people say, you know what, eventually the federal government will say, we can't keep paying for this. We got something different. No one knew when that would happen. That's happening. I wrote earlier this year that the Army Corps of Engineers has started saying to cities and counties, we will help you with your plan, coastal risk management plans. But in return for us proposing this plan and proposing money to help you deal with your risk, we want you, the local official, to agree to use eminent domain to force people out of their homes if we say they should leave. We want you to be the bad guy. We are tired of these great plans that don't work because half people don't leave. That happened sooner than I thought it would. I think the next shoe to drop, as it were, will be when FEMA and HUD begin more aggressively adopting that same approach of this should not be voluntary, this should be mandatory. But it's moving, and it's moving for good reason. The reason is you've got federal officials at the top of these agencies saying, look at how much we're spending every year. We're building back in the same place. It's crazy. Brock Long, who ran FEMA during the big storms and fires of 17 and 18, made this point over and over. We've got to reduce our risk exposure. It's not clear yet whether and when Congress will side with that. I think that's the big question. But I want to now go a little further forward. Again, as a reporter, you don't want to speculate too much. Climate change is a bit different because we know the trajectory. So only for the context of this conversation, I think it's worth looking at what we can guess the trends are. And beyond what we just discussed, one of the trends is going to be whether and when Congress loses the appetite to keep spending almost endlessly and start saying this is too expensive. And that sounds crazy. I think that probably does sound crazy to American ears, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. I wrote from Canada last year that Canada has a version of the flood problem this country has, and in Canada the response has been very different. Instead of allowing endless rebuilding in place, they have said, you know what, we really think people who get hit by floods should rebuild somewhere else. And in some parts of the country, they are pushing that and saying you cannot rebuild where your home was because it already flooded, so that would be crazy. And one of the reasons Canada has been so aggressive is they don't have the resources this country has to just endlessly throw money at disaster recovery. So I don't think it's that radical a notion to think that eventually Congress will say these endless supplemental appropriations don't make sense. Let's try something else. No one can say when that point will come. It could be this season. I doubt it. It could be in a year. It could be in 5 years. But that's sort of the next break point that will change this conversation. But the context that I really want to underline here is the context, the backdrop at this moment is one of almost limitless federal resources, right? Not in terms of the actual line item budgets of these agencies, but in terms of Congress willing to step up with supplemental appropriations that are off budget and almost have no cap. It's almost like no one cares what the amount is. And that changes things. At some points, that won't be the case anymore. And I think the next sort of interesting inflection point will be how do counties and cities react when they're no longer operating in an environment of endless federal resources. But I don't want to sound too callous about that because there's something very tragic about it, right? At the moment, cities and counties are reluctant, in particular, to go with buyouts. They don't want to lose a tax base. That will change, I think, as disasters get worse. But just as cities and counties have more appetite for that kind of aggressive adaptation, will probably also be the same moment that the federal government has way less appetite because it'll realize we can't keep paying endlessly. And so you hear in adaptation circles this conversation, the beginning of a conversation about, well, if we can't, when you use the word save, if we can't save every place that's vulnerable, how do we choose? And what makes that fascinating as a reporter and probably horrible as a human being is there's, of course, no good answer, right? We don't even have a framework to begin to decide how we would answer that question of how to choose which places to protect. You hear different ideas. One is protect the places that have the most property value, which is, of course, a disaster from a social justice point of view. You hear others say, no, let's protect the places that have the most historical value or cultural value, which I think is much more reasonable from a social justice perspective, but almost by definition, hard to quantify. You hear others say, no, those are both crazy. Protect the places that are the most sort of physically, naturally defensible, where your money will go the furthest. There's an argument there. I don't know how compelling it'll be to voters. But like those are the conversations that we've mostly been able to avoid so far. And I think we won't for long. And so I want to come back to this question from the top, which is, well, what does that adaptation mean? I presented it a moment ago as a set of actions you can take, engineering changes, architectural changes, policy changes. But I feel compelled to note, and in thinking about these remarks, it became clear to me, it's also a mindset and a set of cultural values that make those actions work. And some of the obvious ones are as follows. First, belief in science. You really mean to engage this conversation as a homeowner or as a local official, you have to have some sort of fundamental belief that the problem we're talking about is real and that we have some idea what the trajectory is. Otherwise, you're not going to even entertain a discussion about, well, where should I stop building or how should I stop building? You have to have trust in experts to find solutions and to believe that the solutions that experts come up with will make sense. You have to, at some point, have trust in governments to be truthful about those predictions and believe that governments are trying to come up with the best solutions. And then you have to have a willingness, I'm going to say willingness to sacrifice, but you could also look at it sort of as almost, a utilitarian view, which is if something benefits a great number of people but hurts a few, maybe it's worth looking at. Otherwise, you're not going to get any consensus on which places to save and which to abandon. You may have noticed there's a theme there, and the theme is those aren't really things that the US is all that good at. And I say that respectfully as somebody who also has a Canadian passport. There are countries in the world that are good at that stuff. This isn't really one of them. And it strikes me, having covered this for a few years now, that until you address that as a government official or a thought leader or an expert, I don't know how much progress you can make in terms of increasing people's willingness to accept the practical steps that adaptation entails. And I have yet to hear someone offer a good account for how you get better at those items. I was going to close on that point, but it felt like kind of a downer. So let me just note as well, having been in the US for a long time, there's two things that the US is very good at, right? Number one is a sense of charity and a willingness to help one's neighbors, even one's neighbors in the broadest sense who live across the country. And you see that every time I read about a disaster, I'm struck by, the armies of people who drop what they're doing and go down to help. And I think it's sort of an open question whether that same charity in the context of disasters will also apply in the context of helping communities that you've never been to deal with the effects of climate change. I don't know, because it runs up against, mistrust of government. So we'll see. And the other is, I sound like a real booster here, but like this sense of innovation and optimism, right, that defines so much of American life. It's, I think, not crazy to think that sense of optimism and openness to new ideas, new technology will help address some of the things I'm raising here. It's not clear to me how, but to end on one such note of optimism, in talking to local officials around the country all the time, two things are clear to me. Number one, they don't really have a good idea what their options are. They haven't thought this through a lot, but they want to, and they seem very open to solutions. And if there's room for hope here, it probably is that sense that unlike with the emissions side of climate change, where the sides are, the lines are drawn, the sides are calcified, it's a culture war, no one wants to give. There seems to be more room to negotiation and conversation and ideas when it comes to adaptation. I just don't know if we found the ideas that will work yet. But I think, in a landscape that doesn't have much in the way of good news, that strikes me as good news. And I, just on a personal note, as a reporter, I do so many bad news stories that just everything I hear that's a good idea, I think, wow, this is finally something good to write about. So there's, it's not hopeless. I don't want to end on a note saying it's hopeless. It's not hopeless. I just have not yet got a good idea of how we deal with it. So with that, I turn it back over to you and would be thrilled to take whatever questions people have.
Thank you so much. It's great. And there are some questions coming in. I'm going to selfishly ask the first question, if you don't mind. Because I think I'm speaking for a lot of students and other people who sort of have some of the same thoughts. And then I know that Katie and many others have questions. I think we're all probably curious about your conversations and how those conversations go with different constituencies, from FEMA to scientists to so on. And it's so really helpful to hear your experience with networks of people and institutions that are at most risk. But what's also completely fascinating to us is how to position the story to best influence change. And So we're interested in your reporting precisely because you are one of those who is positioned to make a new persuasion in culture and to influence, that other weather of political sentiments that you've been talking about. So I want to ask a question. I suppose it has to do with whether you see a spatial fluency. And I'm an architect, so I would ask this question. But I've noticed that your arguments are often relying on data and attempts to make conclusions from data. Not always. I mean, one recently, was timed because it was about the announcement of FEMA grants, and that seemed to, prompt a story. Or there's millions of things that prompt a story, but data sometimes makes the argument. Or a study with quantifiable data is often the reason for the timing of the story. But to reflect back to you, that reporting really nourishes a design imagination because it allows us to see some points of leverage, sort of openings for intervention. And in our arrogance, we sort of think that what's needed is this kind of synthetic design imagination. In addition to more and more precise measurements of the problems and relationships. So, I think we in the School of Architecture are trying to figure out how to make another kind of spatial fluency, make a story. I mean, we don't just design buildings and master plans, we are working on protocols that are trying to reverse engineer the sprawl that exacerbates risk, or we're trying to work on protocols that facilitate property exchanges that might help adaptation. And it's not a solution, it's not a data proof, it's not a magic bullet, it's not a new technology, it's kind of a design relationship, or it's a process that starts a chain reaction, and it's messy. But it might be, a chain reaction that's about moving to higher ground or about subtracting the architecture that's encroaching on forests or floodplains or something. So it's a process instead of a proof. We think we know a little bit about something, about how to put the development machine into forward, but we also think we know something about how to put it into reverse. But what's difficult is communicating that sort of spatial change or spatial relationship is itself an organ of innovation. There's kind of there's more fluency in quantitative expressions than in spatial expressions. So I just wonder, what advice do you have for us about, kind of how to make those sorts of design speculations the story?
I have to start by saying, nothing that I could offer you guys in terms of advice would be me. Right? I mean, all I can tell you is what I've heard. The one thing that what you're saying triggers for me or brings to mind for me is I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with what Louisiana is doing. So Louisiana got money in 2016 for two things. The thing that everyone talks about is the relocation of a small village called Ile de Jean Charles. The other thing they got money for was what they called this LA Safe program. Louisiana, it's an acronym for something. But the idea was develop a plan for how to move the most vulnerable communities away from harm, but with a focus on process, not really on the outcome. In fact, the outcome wasn't determined and kind of still isn't determined. And what they did was, and I think Louisiana is ahead of any state in the country on this, what they did was they started having meetings with residents who were affected in 6 parishes that were the most vulnerable. And they sort of deliberately and by design, instead of saying, they didn't say, we're going to do this. They didn't even say we should do this. They just said, here's our estimates of the risk you face from sea level rise over time. Let's talk about what that means to you and what we should do. And I think their plan was to come out with some ideas. But from my reporting, and I went to some of these meetings, they framed it as a discussion. And the whole point was by just starting a conversation that was based on acknowledging the problem, they could sort of move people out of this, reflexive sort of fear position into a set of, oh, you know what, you're right. And I'm told people who are involved in the program, who are running the program, that these local residents, just by virtue of having somebody in authority come to them and say, this is a problem, here's what you're facing, let's talk about it, shifted their mind, right? They were no longer sort of barreling down against whatever they thought was coming. They were suddenly, or over time, more open to talking about things they wouldn't previously discussed, like some version of retreat. It's unclear what that will lead to. Louisiana last May, I think it was, produced a wonderful report where they outlined in great detail what they were looking at and which areas were in trouble, but they stopped short of prescriptively saying, here's what we're going to do. And I think it was an exercise almost sort of like, town halls on steroids, where just people being presented with an honest conversation, I'm told, changed their minds about what they were open to. So I think, look, a lot of what Louisiana did seemed really impressive in terms of the outcome. My guess is other states are going to follow that and see what they can learn from it, because I think you're right. If you come in as a designer or an official and say, this is what we're doing, tends not to go well. I've never seen that go well. And Louisiana has gone the furthest of any jurisdiction I know in saying, rather than that, let's start a conversation based on facts, but without an endpoint in mind. And I would guess that there'll be more of that.
Yeah, great. I would love to keep talking about that, but I'm there's a question from Katie McConnell. Katie, do you want to ask it yourself?
Sure. Thanks for your talk. Really appreciated it. I guess as a PhD student studying in the social sciences, I'm curious to hear a little bit about your process and how you engage with scientists and scientific literature. And given that there's so much research out there on climate change and climate adaptation, like how do you sift through and identify research that you think is interesting or important?
Yeah, I'm sure that in describing my system, I would just reveal how slipshod my system is. System's probably the wrong word. Really, I sort of go into a set of phone calls with some idea of what the story topic might be, and then try and find people who have looked at that. I mean, for like the obvious example is managed retreat, right? The number of people who've looked at managed retreat is not huge, and I try to know them and talk to them. And when they've got a new paper, usually, step one, become aware of the paper. Step two, look at the paper. Step three, realize I don't understand the paper. Step four, call the author and slowly begin to understand the paper. And then, over time, themes build up and you get a sense of what the story might be. But Bloomberg and then the Times have been very good to me in that I don't face a lot of crushing deadline pressure. So I can just have open-ended conversations with these researchers and say, what have you found? How does this fit into the body of knowledge previously? What's new here? What do you find most interesting? Usually, it's rare that I'll do a story based on one paper or one person's research. Usually I'll try and find are different people approaching the same kind of question from different directions? Is there a theme that's emerging or a consensus? But sometimes I will do something in one paper, and really it's an exercise in working through my own ignorance, which can be very, very gratifying. There probably is a bit of you wind up building relationships with people, and so you trust them, which probably shouldn't be as much of that as there is, because it's very subjective. But you try to make a point as well as always finding new researchers who you haven't met before. I find you can usually tell, even not knowing the subject matter, you can tell pretty fast if there's something to it that's going to be newsy. But look, reporters, we're the beneficiaries of a horribly lopsided system, right? There's so many researchers in this country producing amazing work that our goal isn't really to get all of it or even get the best of it. It's just to get good bits of it. There's always stuff that we miss. which I'm sure must be frustrating to be a researcher and like to think, I've got this great, why is no one writing about this? And the answer is because people like me don't have, systematic ways of finding it. We're very sort of, oh, I heard about this. What's that about? It's pretty random, is the truth.
So there's a question from Amin Kazad. Amin, are you here? Would you like to ask the question?
Yes, great lecture and hi, Chris. So yeah, my question is about the communication of risk. Is that, reading the economics literature or reading the hydrological literature, sometimes we get fairly sophisticated forecasts, such as, even understanding what the 100-year floodplain is something that I found challenging when I started reading it. And so I feel, how could we communicate risk without making people go through these traumatic experiences of losing their home once, twice, or 3 times? And what in your experience is something that really speaks to the daily experiences of households exposed to flood risk or wildfire risk?
Yeah, I confess, all I really know how to do, I think I can do this, is take an idea and just try to make it as distilled as possible. The question of what will grab homeowners is really tough. I mean, I'm not sure there isn't. I haven't heard a good answer to that, right? Even the example you raise of how to communicate flood risk is so endlessly fraught. We still talk about the 100-year floodplain, and it drives people nuts. But we do. So, like, I genuinely don't know if. I guess my only response that's meaningful would be to avoid putting too much weight on what might be called semantics. I'm not sure how much of this is a question of how things are phrased. I think probably the bigger obstacle is people don't want to hear a message that translates to you shouldn't live where you live, and you can't keep living there, right? I mean, you can craft the most beautiful, catchy, collection of phrases, and if the outcome of the phrase is this community shouldn't exist, and if you had to pay for your own risk, it wouldn't exist. I don't think the phrasing is the problem. I think there's more going on there. But I confess, I benefit from the confusing language used by this research, because part of my job is translating it. So I don't think it's a huge problem. I find it a little bit charming, the convoluted language that this stuff can appear in sometimes. But I would, for what it's worth, I wouldn't put too much weight in this question of how to better communicate risk. FEMA would go over that phrase, but it's just not clear to me that that's what the hangup is.
So there's a question from Maggie Sang. Are you here, Maggie? There you are. Shall I ask your question for you, or shall I do that? Okay. So Maggie is saying, sorry about, it must be some microphone issue or something. We'll work on it. Maggie Sang asks, could you comment on the advantages or disadvantages of private adaptation strategies wherein the pressure is put on property owners? Have you seen any successful examples of community-led, collective, or public-private partnerships for adaptation and or a retreat?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. It's a very topical question. Take wildfires, right? Where I think this is sort of most pertinent for wildfires. Many of the steps that people talk about at the individual household level for wildfires are individual private steps, right? Clearing the brush within the 5-foot combustible zone around your building, making sure that you've got combustible material not in your gutter, putting a filter over any opening so that embers can't get in, what kind of landscape you plant. And this is a real tough thing, because you don't want the states to come in, or the city or the county to come in and say, we're fixing this, because you haven't, though in some jurisdictions they do that. But at the same time, the problem, presenting it as a solution implies, I think, to a degree that's not quite true, that it can work. And I think it can work in some cases, but of course, if you got a house right next to yours and you can't control what your neighbor does, and your neighbor doesn't do what he should do, and your house burns as a result, it doesn't feel like private solutions work. And the thing is, the question of equity and equality. If you've got homes and homeowners that don't have the resources to take those steps, where does that leave them? So I guess I think private adaptations are great as far as they go. But the reason that we talk about this in terms of policy is you've got to, I think, to be responsible, you've got to worry about the households and the individuals and the families that don't have the wherewithal or the resources or the knowledge to take those steps. So if you're just buying down risk in some parts of a community, I don't know how much it helps. It definitely doesn't hurt, and it's good practice, and I think it's worth pursuing. But I tend to think in this terms of what can governments do to make sure that everyone benefits, that you have wide benefits. And I guess the hang up that I don't think you can get around is private adaptation strategy will always by definition be undertaken by those who have the means and won't help others.
Tim Weiskell, you have a couple of questions. Do you like to? You're still muted.
Sorry.
There you go. There you go.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a few questions. They revolve around the question of how the public can get information. At this point, it seems to have to come through the press, and the press is corporate dominated, which therefore means that it doesn't so much tell us the news as sell us the news. This is a rather sad distortion in times of collective crisis, because we only get the news sort of sandwiched. It used to be said about the Times that it was all the news that fits we print, but in fact, it's all the news that's not fit to print. It's all the news that fits between the ads that they print. And the trouble is that some of the ads take over in their import and ability to convince, because they're so cleverly put together by PR people, the public of exactly the opposite of what the news story is trying to convey. Now, this must be something you've run into, not only writing for the Times, but for every other corporate group you've written for. I'm wondering if there's any of that internal struggle that you can let us know about, because we need to develop new channels, it would seem to me, to get citizen science activated by getting citizens the science.
I've never experienced any hindrance in any way at any of the publications I've worked at.
That's interesting, because Andrew Rifkin experienced a lot when he was there at the Times.
Okay. So you're right that people shouldn't rely only on the news for their information. I think local governments could do a better job in some cases. There's an enormous array of nonprofits that work in this field. FEMA is trying to communicate this risk better. I mean, yeah, it's a complicated issue, and the more information, presumably, the better the outcomes. I happen to think that the traditional news media in general, whether it's us, the Post, the broadcast networks, the Guardian, the Economist, the FT, you name it, doing a pretty good job covering this stuff, but it's tough because there's so much noise, and I definitely sympathize with people who are unsure how to make sense of all the stuff they hear about what climate risk means for them. I don't know if there's an easy solution for that.
I see. But sometimes the press gets caught itself into a kind of spurious dualism. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. And they never learn to count to three, as in third, fourth, or fifth alternatives. It may be due to the fact that we're dominated again by TV, and Huntley, Brinkley, and all of the others had two anchors all the time, and they tried to cover both sides of the stories, not thinking that it was necessary to count to three. It's the first thing we have to do in teaching ecology is, listen, guys, you have to contextualize something as nested within larger contexts. And it seems to me that's the problem that environmental writing has caught itself into. It's gotten into the spurious dualism and not into the nested character of the crises at hand.
Okay.
Thank you. Cameron Ramey, you had a question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm thinking about climate migration, particularly intra-US climate migration. We don't really have a good track record with, empathy in our understanding of international migratory issues and refugees. Kind of look at the our attitudes about the border crisis right now. But you spoke to a sense of confidence in Americans' charity for one another or empathy for one another. So I wonder if you have any gut instincts as to how Americans in certain parts of the country that are posed to absorb people from say Florida and California and the most vulnerable areas will react, once these people start migrating in larger numbers. What do you see those attitudes being?
Yeah, it's one of the big questions. I don't happen to have a gut feeling on it. I caution that you be wary of anybody who says it's going to go this way or that way. A few things that I think are worth bearing in mind. One is we don't know at what sort of pace or scale this will happen. I mean, look, if 1 million Floridians wound up in North Carolina tomorrow, there might be an issue. But it's not clear that that's what we're looking at, right? So I think if you have sort of a slow trickle over time, I mean, you read The Grapes of Wrath, right, which I reread recently, and you're right. There's bad moments in history where the generosity of Americans to accept people from a different part of the country has been shown to be wanting. But that was an unusual event. So it comes down, I think, a little bit to how fast it happens, and how it's framed. If people are presented as victims of circumstances they can't control, I don't know. I don't want to sound like I'm making a guess, but I want to hope that people elsewhere would be willing to help. Going back to Louisiana, this is a big issue they're dealing with, and one of the things they're doing is they're identifying sending communities, e.g. shrinking communities, and also receiving communities. And you hear that phrase, receiving communities, a lot in this context. And having been to Louisiana a few times, I don't pick up a lot of sense in sort of the inland towns and cities that they are resentful towards people who had to leave, say, Plaquemines Parish or Terrebonne Parish. Maybe that's there. I can't see it. But I guess the unsatisfying answer is we don't know, and it's going to depend. But definitely anybody who's planning for this in a real way, you're right, has to think what sort of like what's the social conflict that we should expect and how do we deal with it? But I think probably we should separate that question of Americans moving through the country from the much different question of people from other countries trying into America. That's just, if you want to talk about a hierarchy of problems, if you look at this question of what will happen as the flow of, say, Central Americans increases, or people from the Caribbean leaving islands whose tourist economy collapses, I think it'll be a much bigger challenge. So I guess I'm very, very cautiously optimistic, but you're right that it's a big unknown.
Thank you.
Thank you. Zoe Coombs, you have a question. Are you there? There.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for the overview here. And your writing has been a really good guide for us in our work at the Neptis Foundation. We're looking to fund scholarly research to help policy discussions be better informed as we deal with this in Toronto or in Canadian regions. Something we discuss a lot is to what extent will this help if we need public solutions at some level, public infrastructure, does this need to be a public discussion? That tends to engage moral arguments, which tends to be a fairly politicized landscape right now. I think the alternative is that your audience is sort of the more neutral, in theory, civil service, and that these questions get worked out in that way. And I think there's a lot of pushback to that, because then it says, well, then it becomes dry, and government is there to serve the people who fund it and vote it, and it needs to be part of the public debate and more of a kitchen table issue for it to have long-term traction, for people to understand why we need to do this and why they might fund it through their tax revenue, etc. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas about whether it's useful being part of kitchen table debate, or if it's better at a neutral civil service level. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, on the topic of trying not to sound hopeless, one, I think, very real reason for optimism in this field is almost to a person. Every career staffer I've talked to at the city, county, state level, they're always, on this topic, they're always thoughtful and smart and sort of process oriented and aware of the equity trade-offs, and like really the kind of people you would want in those jobs. Like almost to a person, I've been impressed. But I think they would be the first to say, all we can do is give you the options, you the public, you the elected officials, and tell you what the trade-offs are. These things are hollow if you don't fill them with the inherently subjective preferences of the people. How you do that is very important, but I think it's got to be both. I mean, this is going to sound quite imprecise, but like if it's a spectrum between like a bureaucratic decision-making process that the public isn't really aware of, which is sometimes the case, versus a very, hyper polarized political debate, which some of climate change has become, you don't probably want either of those. But I think it's great to have, again, back to Louisiana, some degree of coordinated and thoughtful engagement with the public. I think luckily, this is not a hyper-partisan issue usually, right? This question of how do we cope with the effects of climate change. And so it tends to be moderately productive when it's a public conversation. I don't know, as the stakes get higher is probably the issue, right? As it's no longer a conversation about, oh, how do we best implement this voluntary buyout program? And instead becomes a conversation about, we can only afford to protect one part of this county with a seawall. Which part should it be? That's different, right? I don't know what you do once the tenor of once sort of the content of the conversation becomes, it's us or it's them. I wrote in the summer about Houston and Harris County and how they were working out which neighborhoods should get priority for new flood protection spending. And it as a sort of, it was a very, very hard issue because it became a racial issue. It became an issue of, well, which communities are more or less deserving? And so it can, as I'm sure everyone in this call knows, it can get politicized in a negative way. But I can't think of a case I've written about where these questions can be resolved inside the bureaucracy. And I don't think the bureaucracy wants them to be, because you don't have any buy-in and it's not legitimate. And someone like me finds out about it and then it becomes a nightmare. So I think, again, an unsatisfying answer, but it has to be some sort of a balance. And the question is, can people run these programs structure that public engagement in a way that's productive and doesn't just become a proxy for some other kind of fight?
Jennifer Carmen, are you there? Oh, can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Got it? Okay, great. So I study public responses and perceptions of climate change adaptation. But one of the challenges of studying adaptation and the public is that adaptation is itself jargon. And so I was wondering how you deal with that when in your writing or in interviewing people from the public. How do you talk about adaptation with them? Because it's not just responding to disasters. There's a lot more to it. And yeah, so that's what I was interested in.
Yeah, it's so I mean, the short answer is I've got great editors, and I try to write something in a way that's going to make sense to somebody who is not steeped in it. And when I fail, which is often, my editor will say, "This isn't clear enough. You've got to make this more accessible." But you're right. The number of people who think about adaptation as adaptation is probably pretty small, right? And there is a semantic issue here, right? I mean, even the field is so new that even this notion of what's adaptation and what's resilience and what's sustainability is still being resolved for some people. I mean, I don't want to do too much in the way of like personal anecdotes, but one of my first stories on this topic was about how disasters were already pushing people in public housing out of their homes. And I got a call from Jesse Keenan, who some of you probably know, and he was like, "Dude, what are you doing using resilience and adaptation as if they were synonymous? They're not. What's wrong with you?" And like for half a second, I thought, "Who are you and why are you telling me this?" And then I realized he was totally right. And I had to be sort of much more, and I've since then tried to be much more careful in how I approach the different terms. But I think one helpful thing is to avoid talking about adaptation at a high level and just talk about a specific strategy. I mean, I think the idea of people leaving their homes permanently is not one that is impaired by a heavy degree of jargon, right? The term managed retreat remains a bit jargony, but I think not impenetrable. This question of building codes, I don't think it's super hard to get into. I think at a higher level, when you start talking about mitigation versus adaptation and different meanings of mitigation, you can get wonky fast. But I find a good rule is the more specific you are about a particular kind of intervention or policy, it tends not to be hard for people to get their heads around it. But again, my editors are the ones who make that work.
Kyle Johnson, are you here?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for taking time, Christopher. I really like your reporting. Question kind of builds a little bit off of what Jennifer just talked about, which is jargony in some sense. But do you ever spend any time thinking about there's the concept of deep adaptation, which is kind of assuming that we'll hit some trigger points of large sea level rise or heat beyond human tolerance. And I work in an engineering profession, working for doing coastal adaptation, sea level rise in the Boston area, and often we talk about 2070, 2100 timeframes because it's infrastructure planning and it's forward thinking for now. But do you ever come across people talking about timeframes beyond 2100? Like, what does coastal Georgia 2200 look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm guessing that the phrase deep adaptation is used by a particular group of people to mean a particular thing. I wrote about it, I don't know, 2 years ago, and it's fascinating for those who might not be familiar with it. It's this notion that I think I'm characterizing it properly. It proceeds from the idea that we are facing some kind of societal collapse, and that at some point the adaptation has to happen. It's not physical adaptation, but psychological and emotional adaptation, and it becomes something similar to I don't want to say grief counseling, but like helping people work through this idea of we can't hold on to life as we think of it right now. I don't know if that's the way you mean it, but I'm familiar with that group and sort of that use of that phrase. But yeah, look, adaptation means different things. Today, adaptation means how do we largely hang on to and protect the kind of life that we have now roughly defined. Adaptation also can mean, how do we cope when this, when this kind of lifestyle becomes impossible for some or many of us, right? What do we do if we have to surrender some meaningful degree of quality of life or comfort? And then eventually, like, hopefully never, but hopefully way down the road, what do you do when adaptation means really deeper sacrifices? I think it's a totally valid line of inquiry. I think personally it remains sort of half a step too far down the road for me to spend a lot of time writing about, but they're the right questions. And I've never, I mean, talking to some of those guys, I recall being very taken by how realistic their arguments were, that we should at least be thinking about it. So yeah, it's an important line of thought. I just think it's a bit too far in the future for now.
I think Kate McKinsey had a question. I don't know if she's still here. Are you still here, Kate McKinsey? Maybe not. Well, I'm going to pose a question then, along the lines of the various actors, players that you speak to in your relationship with them and how you're reading them. The big question I have is about FEMA and about the FEMA mitigation director, officers and the whole bureaucracy. How do you interface with them? And to some degree, I guess you said bureaucratic. Do you find that their large bureaucracy is part of the problem? Do you find that their message, or really we're talking about Green New Deal now, but they're still part of an old New Deal, that's scripting a way that we respond to disasters, that's government-led, that's starting from the Dust Bowl and so on. That's a presidential photo op. It's got a particular set of scripts, and I wonder how flexible you see that organization, or how ossified.
So again, Brock Long, who I spoke with a couple of times when he was at head of FEMA, he stressed over and over that FEMA had to do things differently from the perspective of not just rebuilding in place. Craig Fugate, who ran the agency before Brock Long, made the same point. We can't just rebuild in place. I think they believe it. I think they're doing what they can to fix it. I think if they're being candid, FEMA staff would be the first to tell you that they operate under some pretty strict constraints. I would imagine that if you said to somebody at FEMA, hey, you can rewrite the Stafford Act, what do you want to do? They would change the Stafford Act pretty meaningfully, but they know they can't, right? So I don't know if, to the degree that the system of disaster relief we have is ossified, which I think is a fair statement, I don't know how much of that is a FEMA issue. Even I can only say so much on this, but when they have pushed for reform, in this administration in particular, they get pushback from above, right? So I don't, here I'm going to speculate, which is dangerous. My speculation is that if you had a different kind of attitude in Congress and in the White House, and the attitude was, what can we do differently? I don't think FEMA would be, an impediment to that.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'd probably welcome it because they know better than anyone that what they're currently doing can sometimes be futile. So I don't look at them so much as decision makers on this. With some narrow bounds, they are. I think they see themselves more as implementers of this system, which I think is mostly fair. They've pushed hard on some issues. If there's a new administration, I'm certainly curious to know what the administration will do on FEMA and to what degree FEMA will go with it versus resist it. But again, I think FEMA knows better than anyone that you can't keep this system where you construction continues in at-risk areas. They keep on flooding, keep getting washed out. FEMA goes back in, builds them again. They wash out again. I think FEMA will tell you this is crazy.
Yeah. So in the past 4 years, you haven't seen too many people, just given the assault on science, you haven't seen too many good people defecting from that group, or they're still there in case we do have an administrative change?
FEMA, they've lost some people, but I don't get the sense that it's people fleeing, the sort of the war on science that we've written about in the context of other agencies. I think it's just people getting tired. So I don't know. It's tough to guess. I think they are waiting, like everyone else, to see what the guidance will be from the White House.
Right. So there's another question from Catherine McConnell, from Katie McConnell.
Yeah, I guess my question is following yours, Keller. From a research standpoint, I see tons of work being done on FEMA, and I think a lot less being done on other federal agencies around climate adaptation and climate impact response. And my hunch is that part of the reason is because FEMA has been held more accountable to make their data available than other agencies. So for example, I can go on openfema.gov and download huge amounts of data and analyze it. I cannot do the same necessarily or easily for HUD, the Forest Service. So I guess I'm curious to hear from your standpoint whether you feel we as researchers are sort of under-examining certain agencies or maybe even certain levels of government.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious example is HUD, right? I mean, the way it's been put to me, I haven't checked data myself, is that you can find out with pretty good granular detail what FEMA has done in terms of buyouts. You can't for HUD. I don't know why that is. I genuinely don't. I don't know if HUD has some reason to not want to share the buyouts that they've been funded with CDBG money. I don't know if they know and are trying to share it but can't. I don't know if they have no idea what their own data shows. The Corps of Engineers is, I find, somewhere between. They can be tough to get information from. So yeah, I mean, I have no idea what causes different agencies to be different this way. Maybe it's an internal culture issue, but definitely because of the particular nature of the CDBG DOR program as sort of the vessel of these bursts of money, it's really important. It's run by a relatively small number of people. And the way that their new mitigation program, for example, is going to work is really important. So that strikes me as probably an agency that is understudied, but in part because it's hard to get data on what they do.
Paul Barreau, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I wanted to ask about the psychological impacts, which you cited in your overview comments. And I was curious to what extent you think, as a society, we've grappled with the implications of both forced migration, but also people being displaced in place, people who don't move, whose landscape around them changes, and what this means for the well-being of communities, particularly communities that have really strong cultural and historical attachments to landscapes. So, I'm out here in California and Nevada. I work with indigenous and rural communities, and I've been trying to wrap my head around this. And it's not clear how much we've really started to think about what this looks like, or kind of draw out the long-term implications. And I was curious for your reflections on that.
Yeah, one of the points, back to managed retreat for a second, I'm told that one of the big holes is we don't know if people are happier. Like, we don't know to what degree people who are helped to leave their home wind up happier or psychologically better off than they were. And it seems like a real question. I mean, two questions to my mind. Number one, to what degree does it make sense to focus on people's sort of psychological well-being if you're talking about how to keep them safe? I could imagine persuasive arguments in both directions on that. But then to the degree that you are looking at their psychological well-being, I haven't seen any really good research looking at what the outcomes are for different policies. And if you know of any, I'd love to see it, because I think that's either it's because we're not asking the question or we don't have the right data. But I genuinely don't know whether people who have to give up something of their community or their life, how they recover. When I've written managed retreat stories, I've tried to find people not just who are in the process of leaving, but who have moved and have spent some time in their new home. and it's all over the place, anecdotally, right? Some people say, every time it rains, I'm glad I'm here. Some people say that they never got over the place they had to leave. So I'm sure the data is out there. I haven't looked really hard for it. My sense is that it is not an area that we've got a super strong grasp on, but I agree. And for what it's worth, I don't hear local, state, or federal officials talking about this being, help people move to safety, talking about it in terms of the psychological well-being of people. If they do, it's always in the context of, it's very stressful to be in a place that gets hit by disasters. So we got to help people to be safe, but also to be psychologically safe, because we don't want them stuck in this, pressure cooker. I don't hear, I've in fact never heard someone say, an office holder or a civil servant say, what does it mean to people once they arrive in their new home? How happy are they there? How do we ensure that they are happier there? My guess is because the whole idea of manager treat is still so new that people who are in implementing roles at whatever level of government just haven't gotten around to it yet. They're still trying to figure out, how do we get people who want to move. I think once we got more people who have moved, but my guess, somewhat cynically, is this will get onto government agencies' radars once there's evidence that people are moving and they aren't happy, and it's a new kind of problem to deal with. My guess is that they haven't dealt with it only because that hasn't really come up yet. But I confess I haven't seen the data to know what we know on it.
Tim Weiskell had another question.
Yeah, I've got a few, and that has to do with the Society for Environmental Journalism. Are you a member? Is it still functioning? It seems to me that it may have suffered some fatal blows recently from the sustained attack from government and corporate sources. But can you fill us in on what's going on SEJ?
I was a member. I confess I don't recall if I paid this year's dues.
I see.
I am, and I think I remain a member. I don't have information on what their status is, and I'm actually not sure how you would measure that.
You'd measure it by sort of email traffic back and forth, but if you're not in regular conversation with others through it, maybe it's a moribund institution.
I've got no reason to believe that's the case, but I'm afraid I don't know either way.
I see. What about the things like other fellowships, like the Knight Fellowship and the Neiman Fellows and stuff like that? Are you guys in touch with each other about what's needed in environmental reporting these days?
I haven't had a conversation about fellowships, but I don't mean, like, there's no real reason why somebody would involve me in those conversations. So I don't have much to add on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's all. Thanks. Keep up the good work.
I'll ask you, are there, you have your ear to the ground in so many ways, but what about activist groups? Are there activist groups or other cultural persuasions which you find are effective, contagious, something that gives you some sense of hope about?
Yeah, so there are activist groups on things like building codes and sort of consumer safety advocates. I don't. It's hard for me to know how effective they are. I think you personally, I've been more impressed by how local groups, sort of community groups, can sometimes mobilize on these issues when they come up. Again, I wrote that story on the issue of Houston and how to prioritize different communities in terms of flood protection dollars. And it sort of seemed like local groups had been both active and, I think, successful in getting officials to think harder about the equity questions of which communities got money in which order. So it can certainly work. Certainly in Louisiana, there have been local groups that have been involved in the question of how do we make sure that state policy reflects what local residents want. It doesn't seem like stepping back, it doesn't seem like this question of adaptation has attracted the same level of organized community groups and involvement that, say, other parts of climate change have. Like there's no, pick your giant group. There's no NRDC or Sierra Club really focused on this stuff that I'm aware of. So as it gets more important, that might happen. But for now, it seems like it's more local groups that will sometimes turn to this and can have an impact that way.
Katie, you had another question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I have watched people in academic worlds sort of approach the phrase of managed retreat differently. And I think there's a lot of ambivalence among different disciplines about whether that phrase is appropriate or useful. And I'm sort of curious what you think and how you see that phrase being used in the policy world, if at all.
Yeah, it's definitely used in the policy world. Again, I'm gonna say probably a very unjournalistic thing to say, which is usually words do matter. In this context, I'm not sure, Matt, how much words matter. Like if somebody came up with an awesome other phrase that wasn't managed retreat and was like ice cream sundaes, I don't think it would, and I've heard people have discussions. I have yet to be persuaded that it matters that much how you brand these things. I don't know. I think if homeowners are smart, and if somebody hears a way that they can move out of a place that's dangerous and they can make their life better, I'm not sure how much they care whether it's called managed retreat or whatever else. But definitely it's, it was a phrase in formation just a few years ago, and that's the term. I've never heard someone say anything but managed retreat to mean what we are talking about, and think, oh yeah, that's the new thing now. It has achieved sort of a verbal dominance, a vernacular dominance that I think will be hard to shake at this point.
JT White has a good question here. Are you here?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just wondering if in your conversations with local municipalities or groups, if you've come across places where there's a big lack of tooling or technology, and if so, what are these gaps?
What kind of technology do you mean?
I guess to better understand risk or to help, better proactively manage risk at the community level.
Yeah, so like one of the big equity issues, this might be the sort of the thing you mean, is there's lots of federal money, right? Some states are good at getting it, some states are bad, some counties are really good at getting it, and some counties are terrible, right? And the issue, there's a fundamental issue, I think, of fairness, where counties that don't have the staff, the experience, the history, the resources to fill in sort of endless grant applications and jump through endless hoops with FEMA or HUD, they don't get the money. Somebody, I think it was last year, there was a great paper on managed retreat showing that FEMA buyout dollars tend to go to wealthier counties, but then once those wealthier counties get it, they tend to be used in poorer areas. So like a double fairness hit. So yeah, from a distribution point of view, the issue I see with technology is some counties just don't have the bandwidth to take advantage of federal programs. There may also be an issue of data, right? And this, I'm reaching a bit here, but I think there probably is some argument that some smaller counties and cities just don't have the same sort of elevation data and projection data. They can't tell as well as others, as well as like the Miamis of the world, what their sea level rise exposure is going to be or what their wind speed exposure is going to be. And so they can't make as good decisions about where to build and how to build. I'm hesitant to put too much weight on that because A, you can get lots of data at this point. You can go to some consulting firm and buy that data. B, people don't always make good decisions once they have that data. I think so to me, the sort of the technological gap and the knowledge gap that seems most important is counties that just are never going to have the giant teams of staff that they need to get these federal dollars. And I've never heard someone at FEMA or HUD really explain how they expect to get past that. So it remains one of like these great issues of fairness that no one seems to have a good answer for. I hope that's along the lines of what you're asking.
I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I want to ask you another question. And if there's somebody else has a question, please put it in the chat. But how many? Do you have a sense of there being many more Christopher Flavelles around in the country? I mean, at the local level or at the national level, or other people who are forming that narrative that's necessary to really make a cultural persuasion, to sort of make palpable this messy process that's going to be necessary for adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of people who write on this stuff. I think I've been lucky because when I was at Bloomberg, they had so many reporters that I could really specialize in a little niche. And then at the time as well, they get such resources that I can specialize. So I find that other reporters are more apt to approach this as part of the broader climate beast. I'm reluctant. I feel like it'd be folly for me to name names, but there's plenty of great reporters out there who cover this stuff. I think what is currently not a very crowded space will become very crowded and very fast because there's so many storms, there's so many wildfires, so much federal action. If I'm making a guess, if there's a Biden administration and a Biden White House spends more time on this stuff, I think that'll mean a sort of an influx of reporters looking at these parts of the climate question. There hasn't been as much action the last few years because the Trump administration hasn't really focused on this. But I think, again, that'll change fast as reporters sort of follow the action.
Right. In journalism and in other kinds of cultural narratives. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I think we've gotten to most of the questions. At least everyone's gotten to ask one or two. I just want to thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time. And this has been really good for us. And I hope that the exchange can continue if we can be useful to you.
It's been a blast. Can I just say my email address is just my first name and my last is christopher.flavelle@nytimes. I would love, anybody has stuff they're working on, stuff they're seeing, things that they think haven't gotten enough coverage or attention, I would please tell me, because it's great to interact with people who are following the stuff, and I'm always open to new ideas and tips.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you again so much. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming to this conversation, and thanks to the Poynter Fellowship.